What I thought pregnancy was going to be, I'll be honest, was mostly based on stuff you see on TV and the movies. I thought that when I found out I was pregnant, I would start throwing up because that's what they do in TV shows and movies, right? Girl throws up and they're like, oh my God, you're pregnant. I never threw up. I took a nap.
I don't think I thought about pregnancy nearly enough. I just thought, oh, okay, I'll get pregnant. That'll be chill. Maybe I'll be a little sick at the beginning and whatever. And then I'll have a baby and everything will be chill. My actual experience of pregnancy has been quite different than chill. The biggest surprise to me is how fucking sick I was.
You're listening to The Whisper Network. I'm Katie Boland.
And I'm Emily Hampshire.
And on this show, we talk about all the things we usually feel we need to whisper about, like our bodies and the wild things they go through.
And one of the wildest things that your body can go through is pregnancy. I never planned to be pregnant, so I don't have to go on that wild ride.
I would like to get pregnant and have kids at some point, but I will be honest, a lot of the stories that I've heard from my pregnant friends and friends with kids are nuts. And what I hear from a lot of them is the stuff that they went through during pregnancy was a total fucking surprise.
Which is pretty crazy when you think about it, because many women in the history of the whole world, the whole universe, have actually been pregnant.
Yeah, and since neither Emily nor I have had this experience, we reached out to friends and listeners to hear their stories. And friend of the show, Sam Dahl, was one of them. She is currently pregnant and has spent most of her pregnancy feeling very, very ill.
I was blindsided. I'm like, there's no way women do this. How? And like, you're gonna go to work, you have a toddler, you have other shit to do. I did nothing for 2 months. It's like I didn't exist. It was like I just lied there. No other symptoms of pregnancy also. So I just constantly had to remind myself like, oh, this is a good thing. You're happy, you're pregnant. Like, this is fucking crazy. It's a 2-month hangover that doesn't end. The mindset I wish I went into it beforehand is don't be so hard on yourself, because pregnancy is hard.
Another friend, who asked to remain anonymous, called in to talk about the overwhelming fear she felt.
I'd say the worst part of being pregnant for me was the fear. At the beginning, it's miscarriage, it's making sure, tests are passed and the baby's okay. All the way through, it's making sure that the baby's growing okay.
Well, I do feel that thing of like, it'll affect the baby. And I see people around pregnant women always being like judgy, like, are you going to do that? Like, what about the baby? What about obviously no one wants to hurt the baby.
If I do get to be a mother, I do think, because I am so anxious and kind of depressed naturally, I am very concerned what will happen to my mental state. Plus with, we both have PMDD, what will happen to me hormonally. And it does feel like, from what I've witnessed with my friends, it's a joyful time, or you're supposed to only feel joy, but actually I think it's much more fraught than that.
Also, the thing that I see a lot that is scary is that when you're pregnant, you're like this superstar and everybody's like, take my seat and do this. And then the minute you have the baby, everybody's like, oh, the baby. And then the mom's like just a feeding delivery system.
Yeah, I certainly feel like, especially with my recently postpartum friends, there's a huge loss of identity, and then a trying to find what is your new identity outside of just being like an animal that's keeping a small baby alive. So I think that also is something that women can't really talk about. Like, I'm mourning the person I once was. Who am I now? I don't even know or recognize her because I'm not sleeping. Everything is about the baby. And it does feel like there are a lot of whispered conversations that women only share when they feel like they really won't be judged. And I don't know how many places exist like that in society for women, because it's like the easiest thing to judge is not absolutely loving being pregnant or loving being a new mother.
Oh, yeah. And even just as you said that, I'm like, people will think you're selfish and a terrible person if you're like, what about me? Which does sound selfish and terrible person, but like that loss of identity is so traumatizing. Like, I've had that just from relationships. Imagine from an alien life form growing inside of me and then leaving me and then hating me when they're teenagers.
So, to help us talk through some of these anxieties and concerns and to just get some answers about pregnancy, our guest today is someone whose work has been devoted to easing the pressure and guilt while empowering pregnant people to make decisions that are the best for their own bodies. Emily Oster is a lauded data scientist at Brown University who specializes in medical data. Her 2016 bestseller, Expecting Better, pushed back on a lot of the so-called common wisdom around pregnancy. This research was radical. It challenged a lot of what doctors and society expect pregnant people to do and not to do. For example, can you drink alcohol? What about coffee? How much weight should you gain? Well, spoiler, pregnancy is under-researched, and much of Emily's work has challenged a lot of what we accept as fact. The way Emily Oster talks about pregnancy is revolutionary. She offered a source of comfort to women who were confused or frustrated by their doctor's advice or felt infantilized by it, or were reduced to hunting around online and whispering to other women for answers and support. And while her work has garnered its fair share of controversy, it has changed many women's lives for the better. Emily Oster will give you some clear, data-driven answers about the extremely common and yet surprisingly and unnecessarily isolating experience of being pregnant. Hi, Emily.
Hi, Emily. Hi, Katie.
We are so thrilled and so excited to be talking to you today. I just have to say, a lot of my friends have recently started having babies, and the reaction that I got over Instagram to that I was interviewing you, it was as if I was talking to the Pope.
God.
Yes. Like, they all said, I was so lost, and then I read her books, and it helped me so much. It made me feel so much more relaxed. Even now that the baby's born, if I have a question, I Google Emily Oster question. So firstly, just thanks.
Thank you guys for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here. And that is like the greatest thing to hear. So, yay.
So in addition to you writing about pregnancy, you are also a parent. So this isn't just academic for you. You've really lived it. And this show is called The Whisper Network, and it's all about sharing our own experiences, including those that we may want to keep quiet. So we want to get yours. What was the experience that made you realize that you needed to rethink the messaging that gets sent to parents-to-be?
There were a few moments in the first part of my pregnancy that I think were the pieces where I was like, this isn't what I expected. This isn't how I wanted this to go. And one is at the end of my very first prenatal visit. I was maybe 7 or 8 weeks. They had done an ultrasound. Like, it looks okay. And then on the way out, they're like, here's the list of what not to do. And it's quite long. And it wasn't delivered with literally any discussion. It was just like, on the way out, here's your pamphlet of information, including everything to not do. That's just not how I was used to making decisions about what to do and not do. I was 30 years old. I was a professor. I like to overanalyze everything, as might be clear from my having then written books about this. And so it was just, that was a moment where I was like, this doesn't seem quite right. And then there were a few more. We were talking about prenatal testing, where I was told, well, because you're this age, you do this, and that's the only important criteria. And it's a combination of just generally feeling like, well, that's not the only feature of me, and also being a person who research in this space. I was like, I know that that's not how risk works. It's not like everyone who's 30 is the same. A few of those experiences then kind of push me into, when you're like, I should write a book about this.
Yes.
Yeah, that's us. We're like, basically,
we need to do a podcast about this. So we put a call out to people asking about the worst and most surprising things about their pregnancy experience. And there's one in particular that really stuck out and that I've seen firsthand, and it's the fear. I feel like there's so much that women are told to be afraid of. And I have not been pregnant myself yet, but I hope to be soon in the future. And I find that kind of anxiety just so relatable. How do you suggest women navigate fear during what is the most vulnerable experience that they can go through?
First, I think it's really important to just recognize that that is a very common shared experience. And even if you were the most relaxed pregnant person on the planet Earth, which definitely wasn't me, there will still be moments of fear, some of which will be real because, of course, this is something you care about more than anything you've ever cared about anything else. And some of which will be crazy because that's just the way hormones and people are. And so just living with the idea like, okay, sometimes I'm going to be nervous and I'm going to be fearful. And then knowing you can say, okay, well, let me think about, is this something I need to be worried about? Is this big existential fear that I'll be a terrible parent, where I just have to be like, yes, that's a fear I've signed up for my whole life. I'll just put it aside and not, that's always going to be there. Is it something I should really try to address? Like, I'm having some pain I'm not sure about, I should call somebody. Or is it this third kind of fear, which I think is in some ways the most common, which is I'm just panicked about something and I can't get it out of my head, even though it's obviously definitely not something to worry about. Like someone once asked me, I touched a plant outside and it had recently had some natural spray on it and it got on my finger and I washed my finger immediately, but have I harmed my baby? It's like, no, but I totally understand why you're afraid of that, but also step back and say, like, is it really even remotely plausible that that's a problem? So somehow combining, recognizing the reality of this and then trying to discipline yourself a little bit when it is those moments of fear that are just like not about reality.
When you were pregnant the first time and you had anything come up, did you ask friends? Did you like other women, or did you go to your doctor?
No, I went to the internet, Emily. I went to like the medical. I mean, I like
Reddit.
Of course,
that's where we
Reddit,
go.
That's where we go. Yeah. No, I went to like the medical literature. Like I would just be like, oh, okay, what's the research on this? I mean, and I would of course also ask my friends, but I was like a little bit on the early side of this. So I had one of my closest friends is pregnant like 3 months behind me. That was great for her. But yeah, I would just like get on, PubMed and like read stuff.
Yeah. Okay, we do Reddit, but
yeah, no, Reddit has its very good moments.
So, Emily, can you explain this to us like we're in the 4th grade? Like we have no real medical understanding or knowledge inherently because we don't.
We
and
think
many of
we
our
do, but
right. And many of our listeners aren't doctors, obviously. Why were the studies done on pregnant women ultimately misleading? And why did you have to debunk a lot of what we accepted as fact?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So I think there's a few different answers. So one that's very common is a lot of studies on risks in pregnancy compare people who did something to people who didn't, but the thing is not randomized. So this comes up in the context of alcohol, it comes up in the context of coffee, where you're comparing two groups, and one group, had the occasional drink and one group did not. And then you look at the differences in their outcomes. And the problem with that kind of study, the issue that comes up, is those groups may be different on a lot of other dimensions. So in the case of alcohol, if you look at people who drink a lot versus people who don't drink very much or don't drink anything during pregnancy, they differ on all kinds of dimensions: education, income, other resources, other aspects of their parenting, whether there's a second partner at the home, tons of other things which we know matter for outcomes. And so it can be very difficult to learn about causal relationships from that kind of data. It's what people would call observational data. It's very hard to learn about causality from that.
Can you define causality and causal relationships?
Yeah, so a causal relationship would be where you say, if you do this thing, this outcome is more likely to happen. So the simplest way to do this, although it's very hard in practice, is to do a randomized trial. That's how you do drug trials. If you want to know, like, does Viagra work? How do we know Viagra works? Well, they took a bunch of people out of erectile dysfunction. Half of them got Viagra, half of them got a pill that said it was Viagra that wasn't. And then they reported back about whether their penis worked better. It turned out the people who got the Viagra, the penis worked a lot better. And because they didn't know what they were taking, you chose randomly who was taking it, you can be sure it was a Viagra and not something else.
Oh, yeah.
Now, to pull it back to pregnancy, what's really hard is we don't like to experiment on pregnant women.
That makes sense.
Of course, we don't like to experiment with something like coffee or alcohol where we say, well, that's just a choice. And like people wouldn't, there's a bunch of reasons why I don't want to experiment with that. We're actually not even good at experimenting on things where you might think the information would be more valuable. So we don't know that much about antidepressants in pregnancy, even though those are really valuable for a lot of people. But we don't like to experiment on pregnant women, so we don't actually have a lot of good data on that. And this is a piece of maybe also the answer to Katie, your question of like, why don't we have good data, is that the thing we'd most like to do, which is experiment, we're very reluctant to do because the pregnant woman is a delicate vessel.
Yeah, that's a hard conundrum.
Yes.
After the break, we'll talk to Dr. Emily Oster about some of the pushback she's received in response to her research and writing. I know from friends and comments I've read online that your research has absolutely changed people's lives, but you've also received some criticism and negative feedback. I've seen Reddit forums where people point out that you're an economist and not a doctor, and that this isn't your area of expertise. And I'm just wondering, how do you respond to that? And can you explain once and for all why it is your area of expertise?
The core skill that is used in my books is an ability to understand data and relationships in research and to separate correlation and causality. That is what the books do. There's a lot of stuff you learn in medical school about how the body works and about how delivery works and about science and medicine. And I did not go to medical school. But when it comes to the question of what can we know from data and what does the research say about these relationships, that is the thing I am an expert in. I'm an economist who studies statistical methods and correlation versus causality. That is like my subfield within economics. And so in that sense, I think my expertise is very well suited, probably better suited than the training that most doctors get in interpreting data, because this just isn't a big part of what doctors do in their training, which just doesn't mean that many of them have not also learned that, but that is actually core to my expertise, separate from, being a doctor. Just to be clear, I would not, you would not want me delivering your baby. But when it comes to does this study make sense? And is appendix table 3 actually as problematic as it seems? That's what I do. I do appendix table 3, somebody else delivers
does
the baby.
The appendix, the literal appendix.
Does the actual appendix.
Yes. What is the way that you found women to be the most blindsided by being pregnant?
So there are a lot of physical things. I would say the physical piece that comes up the most is just why is there so much discharge? There's just a lot more discharge of different types at different times than people expect. I don't think that's not bad or good. That's something that freaks people out. Or it was just why is so much stuff coming out all the time?
I didn't even know.
I didn't know.
I've never heard of that.
You get a lot of different discharge.
Okay.
Yeah. I think the sort of existential thing that people find surprising is probably how little is known and how much infantilizing there is, because one goes from feeling like an adult to then immediately feeling like a child in the medical system. And that's not very comfortable for a lot of women. And it is surprising.
I want to do a rapid fire here. You tell me yes or no.
Okay.
I'm pregnant. Can I have coffee?
Yes.
How much?
Certainly 2 cups a day. I think if we talk about 3 to 4 cups a day, most of the evidence would be supportive of that. But if you're I want to be a cautious person, I don't want to be making myself nervous, keep it under 2 cups a day.
How much should women worry about weight gain during pregnancy?
Women are often given a very hard time about their weight.
Yeah.
And there are some general guidelines, and those guidelines are kind of designed to keep your baby in a range that is not too small and not too big. Basically, I think people are given too hard a time about this, and there's too much emphasis on individual numbers, right? It's what we call normal weight going into pregnancy. The recommended weight gain is 25 to 35 pounds. You get people who are you're going to gain 36 pounds, as if at that point, the baby gets a second head and everything is over, as opposed to, that slightly increases the chance that your baby might be slightly larger at birth. And that's it.
Yeah. And I wonder if there's stuff in that I would think if I got pregnant, I would probably eat way better and way more because I'm taking care of myself for the baby, as opposed to trying to look good and fit into some outfit. So I feel like part of that weight gain could be like you're just at a healthy weight then.
Yeah, or like you heal your relationship with your body because it's no longer just you.
Because it's no longer just yours.
Yeah.
And I think this is also like particularly for people who have struggled with eating disorders or kind of weight stuff. This can be quite a triggering experience to every week or every 2 weeks or whatever, get on a scale and have someone be like, oh, eating too many cookies.
Oh my God. Oh, that's a nightmare.
It's not great.
I want to steal your rapid fire.
Yes,
so
come
I'm
in.
pregnant, okay, and I'm on so many antidepressants. What do I do?
Are they helping?
Well, yeah, like I would be afraid to just go. If I found out I was accident pregnant, I would be afraid to just stop everything.
Yeah.
I also have this feeling like I froze embryos. I have babies somewhere in a freezer. And I feel like during that time when I had all the like injections of hormones and stuff, like I've never been crazier. And I feel like if I got pregnant, I would need more medication. So my baby's going to be pickled.
Most of the evidence that we have is very supportive of the safety of SSRIs in particular during pregnancy. I mean, it is, of course, hard without randomized trials to rule things out. And SSRIs are antidepressant, particularly hard thing to study because, of course, if you ask, like, well, what's the relationship between maternal SSRI use and, whether kids have depression later, there probably is a relationship there. But, of course, that's partly because there's a genetic component of depression. And so sort of separating that out is really tricky. I will say millions and millions and millions of people are on SSRIs, and there isn't like significant birth defects or anything like that shows up there. Usually doctors will tell you to stay on whatever antidepressant you're on if it is helping because it's important.
But I also think this speaks to a larger thing, which is like, well, like, forgive my French, but like, fuck the mother, focus on the baby. And that to me is so unfair because it's like I have friends who've gone off their SSRIs while being pregnant. And they were much more stressed out. They were very unhappy. And how does that affect the baby? So can you speak to that? Like how women are kind of thrown to the wolves during being pregnant?
Yeah, I think we have a sort of like baby first mentality, which sometimes I would describe as, anything that anyone has suggested could be dangerous for the baby. You should not do that, even if it's infinitely beneficial for mom. That basically it's like what we call sort of like lexicographic preferences. So that's the technical term. But that basically we care like 100% about the baby and kind of like 0% about mom.
What I love so much about your approach is that I think that you're really just a large advocate for women being as relaxed as possible and not blaming themselves for everything that could possibly go wrong or thinking that they're not doing everything perfectly. I guess my question is, was there like a larger political, societal, feminist motivation behind this ideology that you have?
I sort of wish I could say yes because it would make me seem like more serious. But the first book I really wrote out of frustration almost and a feeling of like this has to be in the world. And maybe a piece of that is the feeling like, this isn't the way I want to be treated as a woman on this. But I think it was also just like, this is not right. This is not what's working for me. And I feel like I have to do it differently. And I would like to write this thing in case other people want to do it like that with sort of like no expectations. I think as I've written more about this over time and as I've have a larger platform and get more opportunities to talk to people, the piece that I do feel like I can keep pushing, that we can keep pushing, is this kind of lack of research. There are so many questions in pregnancy and women's health and early parenting where it's just like, oh, we just don't have data on that. And you're like, we could know more about that. It's not impossible. And somehow we're not learning about that. And is that because we don't value women as much as we value some other people? It could be. But it's certainly, pushing, like continuing to push for funding and attention seems so important.
Okay, so from the medical community, what was the most negative and crazy pushback that you got? All your research changes a lot of people's ideas on what we can do when we're pregnant, but What was the most "how dare you" feedback that you got?
One of the interesting things that has happened over time is when this book first came out, I would say like most of the obstetricians that I talked to were like, oh my God, you're like, I can't believe how terrible you are. You know, like there was sort of a lot of negative. But over time, that has become much less true. And I think that there are definitely, I'm sure of course, there's still doctors who don't like this approach. But I think there's many more people who can see the value of helping their patients understand a bit better a lot of the choices they're making. Because much of the book, pieces that are kind of myth-busting, much of the book is just like, let me help you understand what's going to happen so you can participate in your decisions better. And I think ultimately that is something that many doctors do welcome, because it is better if your patients know what is happening, particularly if your patients are like high anxiety, people who are constantly trying to do their own research. This book is easier to give them than, sending them to Reddit or whatever.
Okay, flip question. What was the most exciting feedback that you received from the medical community and women?
Just that it helped them. I mean, I think, from the idea that like people would say like, this made me more relaxed. I was able to have a better pregnancy. Like, you helped me in this time of my life that was hard. Like, that's the greatest gift. I mean, I feel so lucky.
There is also such a drought of, I feel like so many women go to their OBGYN and they're like, I don't even feel like I got to ask any of the questions that I wanted to.
Yeah. This piece is bad. Like,
yeah, talk about this to us. Why? Why are we being treated this way?
So this actually not, I think, about how people are being treated. This is about like the financing of the medical system. Basically, the way that obstetrics works is you get a very tiny amount of time with each patient, and you have to be billing and billing and billing. And like it's not the fault of the obstetrician. It's not, I don't know whose fault it is. Capitalism, I guess, in some very vague sense. But I think part of the issue is then people have this very short amount of time, and you need to be prepared. And this is why I think this is the other sort of piece of the book, and why I think some obstetricians kind of like ultimately feel it's of value, is that I think it's part of it is letting people be prepared for, okay, this is what's going to happen. Like, here are the questions I'm going to, want to be able to ask at this visit. I also think it's why a lot of people like having a midwife instead of an OB, if you're not in a situation where you need an OB, because midwives, those appointments are about twice as long. And there's more space for kind of talking.
Right. Okay, so say I'm pregnant now. I'm going to see my doctor, my OBGYN. What's the best way to advocate for myself? And what are, say, the top 3 questions you would ask?
So I think the main thing you want to figure out is this person going to help you work through something, or how are they going to answer your questions? So I'm not sure that any particular question is the most important question to ask, but like, you could almost pick anything, and the question is, how do they come back? Like, any of the questions that you might have, just listening to how someone wants to engage with you or not, and is that method of engagement something that's going to fit well with like who you are as a patient? I had an obstetrician with my first kid who like sort of pretty clearly was not a good fit, which is why I wrote this book. I have subsequently met many obstetricians where I think, oh, if I had had this person,
my kid would have been better.
Yeah.
Or there may not have been this book.
Yeah. Wouldn't have been this book. I mean, if I had a midwife for the second birth, if I had had one of my co-authors who's an MFM, if I had had him as a doctor, no chance I would have written the book. I would have been like, oh, these guys are great. Like, they're totally listening to everything. My midwife was like, how can we make your like experience of this the thing that you want? I never would have written that book.
Something you talk about a lot that I find really interesting, and that I think correlates with sort of the fear and the anxiety and the perfectionism around pregnancy, is that women are having kids later. And so you're having a child when you've already accomplished a lot or much of what you've set out to, and you sort of put that attitude onto having a baby versus my mother or grandmother's generation when they were like 22.
Yeah.
And now all my friends are basically 35 plus having kids. So what advice would you give a woman who would have a
geriatric
pregnancy?
Geriatric pregnancy.
What advice do you give us when we're starting to try to get pregnant? What's the best way to prepare our bodies? And should we be so terrified about being geriatrically pregnant?
Not be terrified about being geriatrically pregnant. A thing which may make you feel better or worse is that your fertility was basically at its peak at like 18, and it's been declining slowly since then. And so on the one hand,
I didn't know that.
I didn't know that either.
yeah, and so there is fertility does decline through your 30s, but it isn't like there's a cliff at 35. And many people get pregnant after 35 without any need for interventions or anything else. So I think one piece of advice I would give people is just recognizing that it could be a little more challenging than it would have been earlier. I guess the other piece is you got to the college you wanted, you graduated from college, you got the job you wanted, you got the part you wanted, you're becoming successful, and then you're really successful, and then it's okay, this is another thing I'm going to achieve. And it isn't really like that. Your kids are not like that. They're going to be their own people. Sometimes they're not going to do the things that you want. And approaching either pregnancy or parenting as something to win is not going to make it fun.
But that's so interesting to put it that way, because I think a lot of people I know who can't get pregnant, who it isn't happening for, feel like a failure because they can't do, and in something you can achieve, you feel if I work hard enough, if I do, but that's what I notice a lot in my friends or people I know who feel like a failure if they just can't do the latching or the breastfeeding, all the stuff that no one tells you isn't actually doesn't just happen.
Yeah, and I think that we could give ourselves some grace. This is not a personal failure, but also a bit of a recognition that there's a lot of noise. There's just a lot of randomness that we can't work harder, which is not true of, maybe it's true to some extent of your job, but there's a piece of this which is if you work hard, you work harder, that is generally good for achieving more. Most of the time, if you work harder at something, you practice your violin more, whatever, you get better at it. And that's not necessarily true of pregnancy. It's definitely not true of parenting.
I did everything when I was freezing my eggs and I got a really low number. And I was really, really disappointed in myself. But then I realized it's not my fault.
Yes, you worked hard.
Yeah. Something also that I love about your work is your decision-making framework. Because ultimately, as a pregnant person, you just have to make the right decision for you. There's a lot of options. Can you talk about what is your decision-making framework and how to implement it?
So I talk about the idea of what I call the 4 Fs, which is basically to start by framing the question, by deciding what you're choosing between. I think people have a hard time making choices because they often frame them as should I do this or not, without saying what's or not. That's not an action. So just to be I'm going to do A or I'm going to do B. What are those 2 options? The second step is what we call fact finding, that you want to try to collect all the information you need to make your decision and sort of collect it all together without simultaneously making the choice. I think another mistake people make is they will sort of get one piece of information, they'll talk to somebody, and that person will be you should do this. And then they'll be okay, I'm going to do that. And then talk to another person, and they're you should do this. And okay, I'm going to do that. As opposed to saying I'm going to get all the information, talk to all the relevant people, do whatever research I need. I'm going to get all the information together, and then I'm going to make a decision. And I'm going to make the decision with all the information, and then I'm going to try to move on. That people sort of loiter in their decisions, either not making them at all or making them and then rethinking them the next day in the shower and making them again. Let's figure out what we need to know. Okay, we have the information. We're going to make the decision about what we're going to do, and then we're going to implement it, and then we're going to move on. And that's a good process.
Thank you again so much for your work, because it's empowering women, 1, to make the best choices for themselves and listen to their intuition, and 2, to not be so fear-based, because how can you make a decision and have a good experience during something that's vulnerable and difficult when you're so afraid you're just fucking everything up the whole time?
Yeah, I mean, I think if I could tell people one thing, it was you're not messing it up. There's a lot of good choices. And I think so much of pregnancy and parenting, you have this impression that every choice is an opportunity to fail and mess everything up forever. And that's not true.
You're listening to the Whisper Network. We'll be back after the break.
I love her.
I loved her.
She's so cool and smart and well-spoken, and she laughed at some of my jokes and didn't get
your
mad.
Your jokes were really funny, Emily. I loved your jokes. What I like about her so much too, especially because I'm quite a high anxiety girly, she made me feel relaxed, and she gave me the confidence that I have in many other areas of my life around something that feels so like, oh my God, I'm going to fuck it up. I'm never going to get pregnant. When I do get pregnant, I'm going to do it wrong. She just made me feel like, you've got this. It's not that complicated.
Yeah, she does have that vibe of making you feel like her energy gives you confidence. And that's kind of what you'd want in a doctor.
Yeah. What did she say that shocked you the most, Emily?
Oh my God.
I think I know the answer, but what did she say that shocked you the most?
What was it? I'm forgetting it because it was so traumatic.
The discharge.
It's just that's a word like leotard that I don't like. Like discharge, leotard, and smoothie are words that I don't like, and they're gross to me. But yeah, but I also think it's really good that she said that, because all those things, like if I were pregnant and these things happened to me, I would be horrified. And to know that it's normal is so relieving.
I just really liked taking away that, like, there are a lot of good choices and it's sort of randomized what happens or what doesn't happen as far as how you give birth and getting pregnant at all.
Yeah, and that thing she said about it's not something you achieve and stuff, it is, I think, for a lot of women and people like us, is even knowing it's not something you achieve. Like, if you can't do the thing you're supposed to do, it's just traumatizing.
No, I know, but I do feel like, society's different now. Like, we have careers, that wasn't necessarily true even 4 decades ago. Mm-hmm. So of course we're having kids later, but to think that, and it takes like a year out of your life when you have a kid. And if you're on a career trajectory, that's tough. But to think that, oh, my fertility has actually been declining since I was 18. It's not like I turned 35 and then it's like, well, you're fucked. That made me feel better.
Yes, that's a great thing to know. That made me feel better too. That's a great thing to know. Also, I kept thinking about with the geriatric pregnancy, like, you should get a discount then. Like, when you get like a senior citizen discount, you should get like a discount on birthing and doing all that birth stuff because you're geriatric.
I'm also like, sorry, can we rename it? Like, did a man come up with that name?
This has been a great episode. It's made me really happy and solid in my choice that I don't want to have a baby.
You know what? Watching you talking to her, I was like, Emily is feeling great about her choice. Emily knows after this conversation with other Emily that she made the right choice.
Yeah, and she's good at telling you how to make decisions. I didn't even have to bring all the things into the decision making. I just needed other Emily.
You just needed other Emily. I was grateful for the decision-making framework because I am the type of person that would just think about a decision. Like, I would just ruminate for till the baby's 5 about something that I did during pregnancy.
Like, get back in there. I changed my mind. I want to do it differently.
I would be like that. She really is a pioneer in this kind of research and has done so much for women. So just extremely grateful to her and can't wait for her next book.
Yeah, I do think it's really interesting that everybody we speak to, the thing they put out in the world is like us because they were so frustrated they couldn't get answers for themselves. And I do think that's kind of amazing.
And that's our show for today.
And as always, we want to hear from you. You can find us on Instagram at The Whisper Network Podcast, and you can send us an email or leave us a voice memo. We love those through our website, thewhispernetworkpodcast.com.
Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time. Every time I see "we'll see you next time," I think of the Soup Plantation, the restaurant from LA that got closed down, and it always had these little things. We'll see you next time, like spelt like time, like the herb. And anyways, thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.
The Whisper Network is produced by Antica Productions. Our senior producer is Allison Broverman. Samantha McLean is our development producer. Laura Reguer is our executive producer. And Sydney Fior is our production manager. This episode was sound designed by Philip Wilson with theme music by Michael Boland and Nathaniel Smith. This podcast is hosted on Acast. I loved that restaurant. Yeah. I was sad.
Do you
when
know
that
the Soup
closed
Plantation
down.
though? I was so sad.
Because also sometimes you just want a soup.
Yeah, and I'll be right back. Like when you're going around the buffet and you're like, don't take my food. I'll be right back.
That was good too.
Okay.
We love business puns.